The progressive stack is a technique used to give marginalized groups a greater chance to speak. The idea originated in New York City. It is sometimes an introduction to or stepping stone to consensus decision-making, in which simple majorities have less power. The progressive stack technique attempts to encounter what its proponents believe is a flaw in traditional representative democracy, where the majority is heard while the minority or non-dominant groups are silenced or ignored. In practice, majority culture is interpreted by progressive stack practitioners to mean white people, Christians, and young adults, while non-dominant groups include women, people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgendered, people of color, Muslims, and those with disabilities. The stack is the list of speakers who are commenting on proposals or asking questions in public meetings. Anyone can request to be added to the stack. In meetings that don't use the progressive stack, people speak in the order they were added to the queue. In meetings that use the progressive stack, people from non-dominant groups are allowed to speak before people from dominant groups by facilitators or stack keepers, urging speakers to step forward or step back based on their race, sexual orientation, age, or gender identity. Modern progressives, or some call them neo-progressives, are not to be confused with the progressive era between 1890 and 1920. This modern interpretation is a caste system, where victimization is a form of currency. It is the opposite of democracy. It is minority rule by its very definition. This is the very next phase of identity politics. The ideology depends greatly not only on censorship, but self-censorship. The idea of freedom of speech is antithetical to the progressive stack and neo-progressives. This has become a pseudo-religion or cult. A cult fueled by propaganda, and it's propaganda that works. Imagine being a lone, confused, middle-class teenager who is socially awkward, uncomfortable amongst your peers, and insecure about your appearance. All the things a perfectly healthy teenager would experience and must overcome. But now, you have the power of social justice. Now you get to bully celebrities, corporations, or anyone who disagrees with you. You get to call them out on racism, bigotry, misogyny, or homophobia, and vent your anger at the world. You get to pretend to be an actual warrior by ruining the lives of others because you feel they have committed an injustice.
With not one but two Confederate flags on it is front and center. It's the first thing that people see when they walk into this festival. And this gentleman here wanted to educate me on the Civil War. What do you have to say about that?
If you'd like to make a spectacle, I can take your picture right
I'm not making a spectacle. Let me tell you what I want. Let me tell you what I want. The car gone. This is racist.
Wow.
They lost.
Yeah.
This does not belong here in a festival full of people of all colors. I will, because this will be up, and guess what? We will find out who this car belongs to.
I understand your passion.
My passion.
Profanity.
It has no place here, and it should be moved. This video is already on Facebook, but if it is not moved, there will be a letter-writing campaign. I don't care who isn't or isn't offended. It's wrong, and it does not belong here. And as a white man, you have absolutely no place to tell me whether or not I should be offended. Absolutely, because of your race. This is about race, and the fact that you can erase race from the story of the Confederate flag shows your privilege. Only to white people does the Confederate flag mean nothing.
You are doing racial discrimination right now.
There will be a letter-writing campaign to your board if this is not removed within the hour. The hour.
Your opinion is noted.
It's my opinion, yes, but soon will be thousands of opinions if you don't act right. No, I don't need to take it easy. They need to remove the car. Remove the car. What's your name again?
You said you had it already.
I want it again. And you as a person of color, sir, should not be telling me to calm down.
In the future, we probably would not have about to.
Oh, are you part of this too? And as a person of color, a dark-skinned person of color, you're okay with this? Yeah, I'll go there. You should, maybe because anti-blackness affects your communities too, but this is wrong, and you should now.
This is extreme power, and it is extreme power that is unvetted and unearned. The tactics of the neo-progressive social justice warrior is being used by a second and allied group. This group is the cultural Islamist or cultural jihadist. Where the progressive classifies groups by their race or gender, Islamists classify groups by religious belief and gender. This is also why it is so easy for them to brand anyone who criticizes them as an Islamophobe. They play the victim card and invoke moral outrage and take to the streets just as the social justice warrior does. Don't believe me? Try drawing an unflattering picture of Muhammad and post it with your name all over the internet. The ideology of these two groups is entirely collectivist, whereas liberal democracies and the fundamental underpinnings of liberal democracy dating back to the Magna Carta lie with the protection of the individual. This neo-progressive ideology has been growing in academia since the 1970s and 1980s, depending on who you talk to. And it's been brought to a boiling point as people have become more extreme in their support for identity politics, and cultural Islamists have capitalized on this phenomenon. As both Brigitte Gabriel and Gad Saad have indicated, based on their experience witnessing Lebanon's transformation from a secular Christian society to an Islamic society, identity politics leads to identity killing. These are also the people who espouse anti-Israel propaganda and fuel the growing, ill-informed anti-Israel mob. This is why anti-Israel extremists can even be Jewish, because they have adopted the ideology of the neo-progressive cult. This is also why messages defending Israel, based on reason and logic, and what actually occurs in Israel, Judea, and Samaria, fail to enter the progressive echo chamber, highlighting the fact that Israel is a liberal democracy based on the protection of the individual is both irrelevant and rejected. But you ask, what about the progressive stack? This is supposed to protect minorities. Are Jews not a minority? This is irrelevant, because the real motivation behind social justice is not justice. It is power. The goal is to identify power, euphemistically referred to as privilege, and to silence it with pejorative labels. Jews are identified as a privileged class, because in the eyes of the neo-progressive activist, Jews are white and Jews are rich. This is why anti-Semitism is not only not opposed, but in fact it is often encouraged. Israel has been identified as the oppressor, and remember, victimization is the ultimate currency. How has the tiny state of Israel, where every citizen is conscripted and children are taught where the bomb shelters are and how to survive an attack, how have these people been labeled the oppressor? Many like to say the Islamists and their pawns, the neo-progressive extremists, are brilliant at propaganda and messaging. They are not. All they have done is use freedom of speech to invoke a mob that has engaged in hysteria and public shaming on a global scale. The origins of this strategy can be found in the Muslim Brotherhood Charter. Their only innovation is that they completely corrupted international news wires and news agencies on this issue. See Brian Thomas's talk, Behind the News, for a greater understanding of this phenomenon. But that's it. Public shaming. This medieval tactic that is so highly unethical, and in the case of Israel, it is constant and never-ending. Many of you may or may not know, but for the broader Jewish community, freedom of speech has historically been seen both as vital and a threat. Hate speech laws from the last century have helped to fight anti-Semitism through organizations like the ADL and Southern Poverty Law Center. But once again, the neo-progressives have now infected these institutions in the same way this extremist ideology is infecting the digital world through YouTube demonetization, Twitter banning, and Patreon deplatforming. Majid Nawaz, Robert Spencer, and Ayan Hirsi Ali have all been labeled anti-Muslim extremists by both organizations, despite Majid and Ayan being Muslim and an apostate respectively. We've seen the emergence of motions like M103 and the branding of Islamophobia, a word by design capitalizing on neo-progressive victimization culture. This is a form of speech policing, which prevents the freedom to criticize ideas, and that freedom is at risk today. Speaking of police, some of you may know of the threatening message sent out by a police department in England that read, "You can't hide from us if you are spewing abuse from behind your computer screen. Our boys and gals in blue will find you." End quote. How long until a pro-Israel message is considered abuse or Islamophobia by progressive extremists. All ideas must be challenged, and if the cultural jihadists and the neo-progressive sheep continue to strike at our liberal principles one by one, the religious extremists, who do not care about the individual outside their collective, will dominate. The freedom to challenge ideas is fundamental to the principles of the scientific method, and one might argue, of Western civilization as a whole. I have dear friends who know from experience exactly how important freedom of speech is. They were arrested, detained, and tortured by the Iranian dictatorship for challenging the authority of the Islamists destroying their country. This is in addition to the tens of thousands of people in Iran who have been murdered by the state for speaking the truth. Many of our liberal political leaders throughout the world today seem to believe freedom of speech is up for negotiation. All of us must put significant and unwavering pressure on them to stop this. We must be relentless in our zero tolerance for any political leader or their contributors endorsing the suppression of speech and freedom of thought, irrespective of the excuse to whom they or the neo-progressives claim to protect. In the case of the anti-Israel propaganda, restrictions on speech will not protect it from the global smear campaign, but in fact make things worse. In the future, advocating for Israel will be considered hate speech. You can see both the neo-progressives and cultural jihadists already attempting to plant this seed. Freedom of speech is like a muscle that society must exercise and exercise it frequently. If it does not, it begins to atrophy and it dies. Be vocal and do not be apologetic, and we may retain the right to freedom of speech in the future.